Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling the American Revolution. It's a really foundational period, right? Everyone talks about it, but maybe the full complexity gets missed sometimes.
Yeah, definitely.
We've gathered a whole stack of fascinating sources to help us kind of cut through the noise. We want to look at how this huge event actually unfolded, what really sparked it, and why we still feel its echoes today.
Absolutely.
Our mission, like always, is to give you a shortcut, basically, to understanding this really pivotal moment in history.
And it's a period that often gets simplified, just a few key phrases. But our sources show is much more complex, a long, sort of intricate buildup of ideas and events.
Okay.
So we'll trace that sequence, how these 13 pretty different colonies became a new nation. And crucially, what that tells us about self-governance and, well, individual rights.
So let's start there. When we say American Revolution, what are we actually talking about? I mean, it was a war, obviously, but our sources frame it more fundamentally like as a radical fight for self-determination. So 1775 to 1783, the colonies break away from the massive British Empire, form the United States.
Right.
But like you said, this wasn't just some sudden explosion, was it? These tensions, they'd have been simmering for a long, long time.
That's such a critical point. Our sources really emphasize, these colonies had been under British rule for, well, over a century before things really started changing in the mid-1700s.
Wow.
It wasn't until around then that this sort of widespread feeling of being exploited or systematically used by the crown started to really take hold.
Right.
It wasn't a flashpoint. It was more like a slow burn, that eventually just caught fire.
A slow burn. I like that. And that ignition point, the spark that lit that fire, it often comes back to one thing, doesn't it? Taxes.
Taxes, yeah. Always taxes.
Specifically after the French and Indian War, which was really costly for Britain, they were deep in debt and they looked across the Atlantic to the colonies to help pay for it. But the big sticking point, it wasn't just the money, was it? It was about who got to decide.
Exactly. Who had the authority?
Which is where we get that famous phrase, no taxation without representation.
Precisely. And what's really interesting is how our sources show this wasn't purely about pounds and shillings. It was about fundamental rights, about authority.
Okay.
Take the Stamp Act of 1765. That wasn't like an external tariff on trade. This was an internal tax.
Okay.
A direct tax on things used inside the colonies. Newspapers, legal papers, even playing cards.
Wow.
And the colonists felt strongly that only their own elected assemblies had the right to impose that kind of internal tax, not Parliament, way over in London.
So it's the principle. It wasn't just, oh, no, more money. It was, wait, you can't tax us directly like this. We don't have anyone speaking for us over there.
Exactly that. And then you have the Tea Act of 1773. Now, this one's a bit tricky because it technically could lower the price of tea for some people.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but the catch was it gave a monopoly to the British East India Company, which was struggling.
Okay. A bailout, sort of?
Kind of.
Yeah.
But it was seen as this deliberate move to undercut colonial merchants and, again, assert Parliament's right to control colonial commerce, even if it meant helping one specific company.
Right. So it bypassed their own guys?
It bypassed their merchants, exactly. And that move, maybe more than anything else, just pushed colonial patience right to the edge.
And that leads us, of course, straight into probably the most famous protest of the whole era. December 1773, the Boston Tea Party.
Iconic.
A group of colonists famously dressed up as Mohawk Indians, although the sources debate how good the disguises were. They sneak onto ships in Boston Harbor.
Right.
And just chuck 342 chests of tea right into the water. Our sources really paint this as this, visceral act. It wasn't just symbolic. It was direct action. A real turning point.
Absolutely. And the British reaction, it wasn't subtle either.
Yeah.
They came down hard.
Yeah.
They passed a series of laws that the colonists quickly dubbed the Intolerable Acts. Punitive measures.
Intolerable. Says it all.
It really does. They closed Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for basically strangling the city's economy.
Oof.
And they seriously tightened British control over the Massachusetts government, took away local power.
So if the idea was to scare them back into line...
It completely backfired. It did the exact opposite. It just ramped up the tension, pushed more colonists who might have been on the fence towards taking a more radical stance, united them in a way.
And this rising tension, it finally just boils over into actual fighting in April 1775.
Lexington and Concord.
Exactly. The British march out trying to seize colonial weapons and supplies, and shots are fired, the first shots of the war.
The shot heard round the world.
That's the one. Not just because it started the fighting, but like it signaled this was it. No turning back. We're moving from political protest to actual armed revolution now.
Yeah. And what's interesting, our sources suggest that even at this point, not every colony was immediately shouting for independence. There was still some division.
Right. It wasn't totally unified yet.
Not completely. But the British cracked down the intolerable acts, then the violence at Lexington and Concord, that really pushed a critical mass of people over the edge. It made independence seem not just possible, but maybe necessary.
It set the stage.
It absolutely set the stage for a truly pivotal, and you could say pretty audacious, declaration.
Audacious is a good word for it. July 1776, Philadelphia. The Continental Congress gets together, and this brilliant guy from Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, he gets the job of drafting this document, the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah.
July 4th, they adopt it. And the message is just crystal clear. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Powerful words.
That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Boom.
And this wasn't just, a Dear John letter to King George III.
Right.
Our sources show this was a radical statement. It laid out a whole new political philosophy based on self-governance, natural rights, ideas that were truly revolutionary for the time. But, like you suggested, just saying you're independent doesn't magically make it happen.
No, unfortunately not.
The war had already started, and it still had 7 incredibly tough years to go. It really shows how these ideals, they often have to be fought for, literally, on the battlefield.
So let's talk about that fighting. The war itself. There were countless battles, big and small. But our sources usually highlight a few key moments, real turning points that shifted things for the Americans.
Right. Saratoga is often mentioned first.
Saratoga, 1777. Why was that so huge?
Well, it wasn't just a victory. It was a really decisive American win. A whole British army surrendered.
Wow.
And that proved to the world, maybe more importantly, it proved to France, that the Americans were serious, that they could actually win this thing.
Ah, the credibility factor.
Exactly. And that success directly led to France officially joining the war on the American side, which meant money, troops, and crucially, a navy. That was huge.
Okay, that's massive. What else?
Then there's the winter at Valley Forge. Same winter, actually, 77 into 78.
Right, Valley Forge. That wasn't a battle, though, was it?
No, not a battle. But our sources stress how critical it was. You have to picture it. Brutal cold, lack of food, clothing, rampant disease. The army was on the verge of falling apart.
Sounds grim.
Incredibly grim. But General George Washington showed just extraordinary leadership. He not only kept that ragged army together, but he used that winter downtime with help from European officers like Baron von Steuben to train them, to turn them into a more disciplined professional fighting force.
So, like, forging strength out of suffering.
In a way, yes. It was a strategic move that arguably saved the Continental Army, showed incredible resilience.
Okay. So Saratoga brings in the French, Valley Forge strengthens the army. What's the final big one?
That would have to be the Battle of Yorktown in 1781.
Ah, Yorktown, the endgame.
Pretty much. This was where that French alliance really paid off. A combined operation, American and French troops on land, and the French Navy blockading the coast.
Gotcha. Trapped them.
Exactly. Yeah. They cornered the main British army under General Cornwallis. He had nowhere to go. His surrender at Yorktown basically ended the Reger fighting of the war.
Basically broke the British will to continue.
It really did. The war officially ended 2 years later, 1783, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris.
Oh, okay.
And that treaty formally recognized the United States of America as a completely independent nation. Done deal.
Wow. What a saga. So after all that history, all that struggle and bloodshed, why should you, listening right now, care about the American Revolution today?
That's the key question, isn't it?
Our sources really hammer this home.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about creating a new country on a map. It was about the birth of a set of ideas that are still incredibly relevant.
And what's so fascinating is how these core concepts that were forged in that struggle, things like popular sovereignty, the idea that power actually comes from the people,
right?
The emphasis on individual rights, freedom, equality. These were just like abstract thoughts in a philosophy book.
But yeah, they had real consequences.
Exactly. They were fought for, they were written down, codified, and they became the foundation for a totally new kind of government. Which raises a really interesting point. How did these revolutionary ideas, born in the middle of a war, actually become the practical rules for running a new country?
Yeah, how do you translate life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness into, like, actual laws in government. And when you think about it, the whole structure of American government, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, protecting specific freedoms, the idea of checks and balances so no one part gets too powerful, the very fact that leaders are elected.
All of it?
All of that comes directly out of the revolution and the debates that followed. It's such a powerful reminder that these concepts we might take for granted, they weren't just handed down, they were demanded, fought for by ordinary people who just decided they wanted something better, something different.
Absolutely.
What an incredible journey from those first simmering resentments and those iconic protests like the Tea Party through the brutal years of war, Saratoga, Valley Forge, Yorktown, right up to the profound ideas that came out of it all. We've really unpacked the layers here, haven't we? Showing how deep the roots of this revolution actually go.
It's a deep dive that really reminds us, I think, that fighting for liberty, for self-determination, it's rarely neat or simple. It's usually a pretty continuous, evolving story of human struggle and, well, aspiration.
Yeah.
And maybe something for you to think about after this is, how do those inherent tensions, those evolving definitions of freedom and equality that came right out of the American Revolution, how do they still shape arguments, debates, and even movements for change right now in our own time?